Everyone. Thank you for tuning into today's episode of What's New in Data. I'm really excited about our guests today. We have an expert in AI and machine learning. We have Abi Aryan. Abi, how are you doing today?
Hey, John, what's up? I'm doing good. How about yourself?
Great, great. We've been talking about doing this episode for such a long time, and we finally found time in our schedules where we were able to make it work. So I know the stuff you're working on is of incredible interest to our listeners around LLMs and LLM ops, and you're also working on additional collateral, including a book on that topic. So yeah, just it's awesome that we're able to dive into these topics. So Abby, tell the listeners about yourself.
Well, I started studying maths in college, enjoyed it, and did minors in computer science, but eventually was planning to get into finance. Hated finance people, didn't want to make money for the sake of making money. Ended up in technology industry. So business intelligence was where I sort of landed first. Eventually, I naturally transitioned into data science and implementing other people's models. I was like, this is all fun. Yes, I can implement all of these models that are already out there, but can I build these models? So after working in the industry for like about 3-4 years, I was like, I'm going to go to UCLA, be a visiting research scholar. So I did research stuff for about 2 years. I was working at the intersection of causality and deep learning, trying to translate intelligent agents and break them down and figure out what intelligent agents really are from like three different perspectives. One was basically how does AutoML work? Second was basically how does emotion recognition work? And the third was multi-agent systems. But eventually got bored with the hyper competitiveness or 0-1 games of academia, if I can call it so. Came back to the industry. And one of the quick things I realized was the data pipelines were broken, as in there was not enough. When I came back to the industry, it was more so like around 2019. Most of the companies were still already on board with, yes, we want to invest in deep learning, but there wasn't enough label data at the companies that I was working with. So that was more so what I specifically started working on, which is building automated data labeling pipelines. Initially worked with some insurance companies and then entertainment companies. Entertainment was fun because what I was working on was more so like a video streaming company. And video streaming is really fun because you have three different modalities of data. You have the image, which is going through. You have the text, which is basically the subtext of the image, and you have the video as such. And you want to classify the videos, basically what is harmful, what's not harmful, what should be classified under which category. And doing it manually for a video company like TikTok, where a lot of data gets uploaded at the same time, it's really hard to put people manually to do all of that. Gets incredibly complex. So that was where I was working on. Eventually, I had fun, but I kept on doing consulting, but shifted a little bit more towards projects, which were AI for good projects because I wanted my work to carry value. So instead of saving life kind of projects. And right now, I'm very much like focused on my own style. We're building basically large language models to be able to run them on very small devices. You could say tiny ML devices. As such, there are some specific things I'm focusing on, which is basically like the evaluation pipelines. Uh, and yes, as John mentioned, there's a book which is going on the side. Just finished the first deadline for that one. So 2 chapters are finished. I'll have the second deadline come in end of January, sometime around that. And then we'll have the early release out. And the full book comes out, I think, in August and September.
Excellent, excellent. A lot of incredible stuff going on, and I know a lot of people. Your time is incredibly valuable. A lot of people want to work with you on these specific topics. If we were to dive into one, so you mentioned you were doing research at UCLA before doing industry work. You worked on intelligent agents and auto ML. Can you dive into, first of all, like what is an intelligent agent?
It was hard to define because, again, the first thing is defining what is an agent and, what can we say to have agency, which is basically the ability to think for itself. And what my research work concluded was there are different levels of agency that any organism does have, any living organism, and obviously there are non-living organisms as well. But when we go into intelligent agents, we can sort of break it down by, yes, it needs to have some sort of agency, which is to be able to plan and to be able to execute tasks. Again, there's a common perception that, humans do have their own agency and, they're somehow this self-content. I'm not sure what's the exact word for it, but basically we do have some sort of conscience, which we believe that machines don't have. But I think it's more like an ecosystem which does drive our decisions. So in terms of machines as well, as long as they have an input output. So for us, the goal is to be able to optimize for happiness. The goal is to be able to reduce the pain that we have at all times. And that's the goal that we're working towards. It can be, optimizing for short-term happiness, or it can be optimizing for long-term happiness. When it comes to pain, it can be optimizing for long-term pain, or it can be optimizing for short-term pain. So those were pretty much the principles that I was working towards, which is what would be those kind of goals that any agent would have. Uh, so for an agent, it could be it would very much be defined by the creator of the agent itself, which is, what is the task that it's trying to do? Because again, they're planning agents and they're execution agents. The planning agents are able to break a problem down into very simple tasks itself, whereas an execution agent, it works more like a connector and orchestrator of all sorts.
Very interesting. And this seems like something that a lot of people that work in data and AI will need to familiarize themselves with. And what you're writing about now, the work you're doing through your startup, and like you mentioned, you're working on an O'Reilly book. I'd like to zero in on that as well. But it's certainly a category of problem solving that people will need to familiarize themselves if they work in data and are interested in future problems in the industry. So that being said, tell us about the book you're writing. You're writing a book on LLM ops.
So after working in the industry for a while, I quickly realized a lot of stuff that we were building, we were incurring technical debt as machine learning engineers, as data scientists. And within the company itself, I started transitioning more towards MLOps itself. When LLMs came around, most of the challenges that were already there in machine learning are now 10x. And as we go further, as we see more complex models, I feel like these challenges are going to increase exponentially. So some of these challenges are around for LLM specifically, which is, I say, the first challenge is more so around security, which at this point, a lot of people are talking, but companies are considering, but it's still sort of like swept off the rug, if we could say so, which is, yes, oh, yeah, we don't really know if the predictions are reliable, but you know what, we'll take it as an afterthought. So that's one thing. The second challenge that there is basically around scalability, which is how are we scaling our resources to be able to make sure that we're able to stay cost efficient. And, cost efficiency is one of those things which I feel like, is one of the stopping factors where a lot of companies are investing, because as we go further, fantastic. Right now, the models are not super expensive and the costs are coming down for OpenAI and all of these API-based companies. But as you're integrating more and more models within your data infrastructure, as well and as you're storing more data within your data warehouses, that cost will increase. And there was that one question which was there with MotherDuckDB that I was really fascinated by. which is how much data do we need to store and how much can we get rid of eventually? And when do we decide is that point when we can get rid of that data? Because it stops being relevant, or it's more of it becomes more of a debt. Then it is an asset, it becomes a liability. So that's one thing, second goal. And the third is basically job business, building LLMs in such a way that they are able to be reliable. Because again, I don't feel like there's enough discussion on things like, prompt drift is one of the things that people are talking about. But what about data drift? What about concept drift? What about the dependencies on which we are sort of building stuff? Alerts then happen to be unreliable. Yes, there are too many packages, but how many of them will end up being uh, managed over a period of time? Uh, those are still questions which I feel like are not really answered that well. So it's like, fantastic. This is a good time for somebody to talk about operationalizing these large language models. Like, fantastic. You can build one large language model and impress everybody else, but can you build an infrastructure and product around it, which tends to add a value? Because at the end of the day, sure, there's a lot of investment going into the field, but there will come a time when people will say, what is the revenue that you're driving out these models? The
Okay.
fanciness isn't really gonna fascinate people for a very long time.
Yeah, very cool. And I want to zero in on one of those points. So your book LLM Ops, managing
Yeah.
large language models in production. You had a great point, which is, yeah, you can build a lot of technology around this, but I want to ask you, what does it truly mean to operationalize LLMs?
So I think there is this one big discussion, which I'll reference, which is what's the difference between LLM ops and ML ops? And I think that would be a really good point to start. So I'll say to that, which is while a lot of components throughout the model pipeline remain the same. Yes, we're doing data collection. Yes, we're choosing a base model. We're doing some sort of fine tuning. We're doing some sort of evaluation, deployment, monitoring, or reliability engineering on top of these models. Yes, that's all there. But the big difference is these models are no longer just models. What I look at them is basically more like connectors and orchestrators in themselves. And that's where the big difference is, which is they've stopped being a cog in the wheel, if you could say so, and they've become the entire wheel where you're interacting with the models directly. And they've become integrated in the product in such a way that you're not really thinking about just the model performance as a standalone feature. You're thinking about the entire product experience as a whole, where things like latency suddenly come into picture, things like security, or how are the people interacting? What's the PII, which is personally identifiable information that's going into the model in real time? Or, what's the language for the model looking like? So those are all the things that make a big difference. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, because I feel like, while the tools may remain safe, which is, yes, where you still use inventor, will still use Sheldon, will still use Shim, most likely. But there's a very good chance the way they become integrated into our entire infrastructure becomes very different, and the stages at which they get integrated will be quite different.
Excellent. And describe the day to day of someone who's doing LLM ops. That's something I'm super curious about, and I like how it differs from working as a ML engineer or a data scientist.
One of the big questions, which are one of the things which I've been trying to do, which is taking the focus away from picking up the new recent model and going more towards, can we build an end-to-end pipeline for this? And what it means by that is now the pipelines look different. First, so very simple thing, which is let's talk about like the data collection or the data management stage. So the first thing is basically how are we dealing with noise management, which is identifying and removing all the irrelevant information. How are we dealing with data augmentation? How are we obviously tokenization is quite easy, I would say, because you can use tokenizers available from Hugging Face. How are we dealing with data deduplication or data sanitization? Those all things sort of need to be integrated within the pipelines itself. And then there's evaluation that gets integrated right over at that stage. Then moving on to the base model. Uh, how are we picking up the base model itself, which is how are we controlling the customizability? How are we making sure that we remain cost optimal, or at least we do have some sort of parallel deployment run again so that we can sort of focus on, yes, this is a feature that we want to release, but what's the performance of the existing model itself and how much does that differ? So it's very much like right now for me, it's very much around pipeline design.
Mm. It seems like it's a yes, you're working with data, but it's a different class of problems. Whereas, maybe a data engineer might be more focused on, hey, let's just move data between various pieces of our infrastructure, like our database, SaaS apps, into data warehouses and data lakes. And once data's in the data lake, we can figure out what to do with it there. But with LLMs and machine learning, there's this, making sure the data is clean and precise, right? You have like accuracy is so much more important because ultimately these LLM ops, like you said, they're agents, right? They're gonna,
Yeah.
automate decisions and do this type of work. So how would you say the tooling differs?
So the tooling, I would say, more or less would stay the same, which is because again, there's that difference, which is most of the ML companies, they cannot keep building tools for the old machine learning models. They want to raise money, they want to stay relevant. So most of them have already transitioned to providing support for large models. And for now, obviously, large language models were so large vision models and then eventually multimodal models itself. So when we talk about companies like, let's say, Qflow or MLflow, they've already provided tooling for large language models. So I wouldn't say that the tooling in terms of the providers would change. Sure, there will be a few new providers that will come up, but that does always happen in the space, doesn't it? Uh, So my concern is more like not really like the big change is not really around tooling. The big change is around goals or what we can accomplish. And for these models, what that would be, which is what's the relevancy of the inference that you're making, and B, what is the latency of the inference that you're making. And the third thing, if we could say, is how are you managing the scale of your entire operation, which is the model as well as the data that you're dealing with, and all of the pipelines that you're running as well, because there will be induced latency if there's evaluation happening at so many stages, or if you're using a multi-star architecture as well to run different models. How does the complexity work when you're running each different model as a service as well?
Excellent. And, you have a great academic depth on this topic, along with the industry view and scene implementations, which has inspired you to, start working on your book and your company, which we'll get into that. But I also want just your high level view on the current state of AI and LLM ops in the industry.
So I would say there are not a lot of people focusing on operations. And there's, again, like I said, there's far too much focus on the next big fancy model. And one of the reasons for that was having this discussion on Twitter about 2, 3 days ago with Greg Kremit. And he was like, there are companies that are trying to hold back on building pipelines and building infrastructure around a particular model because they feel like the next model variation that comes in may not require all of that infrastructure, may actually simplify a lot of things. So what's the point? Wouldn't that not be technical debt in the future? And, the answer to that is very simple, which is there will be complexities with text. There will be complexities with vision. There will be complexities with images or, with videos as well. There will be complexity with audio as well. Knowing what are the key factors that you want to optimize for with languages instead of focusing more so on what is the tool that we can use, but focusing more so around processes would make a lot of difference for companies. So having like a process oriented mindset with any sort of model that you're using right now is basically the key to scaling in the future, and the key to successful deployments in the future. Just because there's a great model out there doesn't mean it will not degrade with time, or the performance will stay the same, or there will be more companies continuing to work on those. So those are things I don't feel like most people are considering right now. And while we've seen that in person with the performance decline in GPT-3 and GPT-4 models, where in closed source models, again, we don't even know the updates that are going in the models itself. So yes, there are plenty of people who build those very complex prompt engineering pipelines, and we end up being useless after like one update because there's substantial amount of prompt drift with the new model. But again, one of the big reasons for that is because they haven't really built a process around thinking, what is the key thing that we are optimizing for? How does this model actually work? What is this really optimizing for? They don't have evaluation in place where they can really very quickly just patch things up together. So that big gap there is basically the big gap across the industry in my conversations with people. And there are companies like Weights and Biases that are building really nice tracing tools, where they're very simple right now, catching very basic things, which is, are there any system failures within the pipeline that you're building itself? But I think we need more than that within our tracing tools, or within any sort of observability tools that are out there.
Excellent. And tell me about, what you're working on at Abide AI.
So the goal is more so to work on just evaluation itself, which is why the name Abide, because you want the models to abide the rules. But again, I personally was more fascinated with, there's this big vision I had since I was quite young about not having dependability on other humans, but instead of machines, where they sort of exist around us as more like companions taking care of us. Or not as human companions, but more so like, where the technology becomes smart in the sense that if you're sleeping on a bed, it should automatically check for your body vitals. And the moment you wake up, your day should be designed as such for your optimal performance. It should automatically give you recommendation on how much water to drink. You should go for a walk based on your sleep and all of those things. So I've been very much fascinated by that whole IoT kind of space. And I feel like while a lot of models will come in, but the big questions when we look at these, any sort of edge ML devices, if you could call them so, or you call them tiny devices, is basically like you have very small sensors, or you can store very limited amount of data. So you have some sort of resource constraints as compared to working on very, very big devices. So those are basically the devices which I'm trying to optimize these large models for. So right now, very much in early stages where I can't say, okay, we've established this thing, or we have entirely worked through this thing. But it's very much so optimization, making sure that we're able to run these very large models seamlessly on these very, very small devices. So, my IoT dream can come true
Yeah.
where everything is sort of personalized for your own preference.
And so how, like what optimization, maybe this is your secret sauce you can't share, but I'm going to ask you anyways. And you can tell me whether you can get into that topic or not. Like, how do you optimize it so that I can run on, these small devices like IoT devices and things that don't like have, massive amounts of compute, storage, memory, GPUs, etc.
So I wouldn't say there's a secret sauce, because the techniques are pretty much established in the field, which is there are a lot of people who are focusing on, let's say, quantization. Where I'm focusing more so is basically on neural architecture search, which is basically using the best strategies to be able to optimize for what is the model that should be able to run for that inference itself. Uh, so that's the key thing that I'm focusing on, because not every model is built the same, and you don't need a big model for everything as well.
Excellent, excellent. And that's such a great point. You don't need a big foundational model for everything. You can have these smaller, precise models. Like, what is it like from a technical standpoint? What does it mean to have like a, you know, a larger model versus like a small, precise model, and what enables it to be, maybe we call it like a smaller neural network or it is.
Yeah.
I'm very curious about that.
So one of the key big differences is basically the number of parameters of the model itself, where the higher the number of parameters, obviously, the more information or the more relationships it's able to store. But it would come down to two simple facts, which is, are we trying to build a model that stores a lot of information about a lot of different things? Because that's what these very big models are doing, which is they're more generalistic. Whereas for a very specific application, which is when they're working with sensors, we don't need a wide space of application itself. The second thing is basically a more focused around the operational scale of these models, which is, you could say, do we really need to scale it to more things as well? Which is, do we want to use the same model for all the application that we have internally, or do we want to have a model specifically for each one of those different things? So those are the big differences where I feel more like generalized models are fantastic, but they're fantastic when you're doing copywriting. They're fantastic when you're doing generalistic applications, but not every model needs generalistic applications. So when it comes to the selection itself, there's advantages in, again, maybe one more thing I'll say over there is there are ways to, a lot of patterns that are being stored in the model, or a lot of learning that we're storing within these parameters. Some of them are repeated because, again, the data that is being presented to them, we're not looking for linear independence within the features itself. So you can considerably reduce the size of the models itself by making sure that the data is unique enough. And what that also does is, if the data is unique, there's less chances of an inherent bias, as well as memorization, which is the big question that people are asking with large language models, which is, are they just putting out information as it is? Or, are they remembering certain thing which remains in the database itself?
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. It sounds like the problem you're solving is definitely a category that is going to require some in-depth solutions, like the one you're working on. So with Abide AI, who is your main audience? Who would actually use your product?
That's something we're still working out on. But for me, I think the main ones would definitely be like organizations. So for like companies or large buildings that are investing in like better architecture, or, more clean solutions or energy efficiency and all of those things, because that is the one thing that we also sort of need to reduce. And we need people to sort of focus on that space. So why? Yes, in a way, it's more like, I think, focused towards two markets. One, you could say luxury market, in the sense like people who want all of that comfort and don't care. Like people who love gadgets for the sake of loving gadgets, more people like
Mhm.
me. And the second are the kind of organizations that are interested in saving costs.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, and those are really critical problems to solve around cost reduction and organizations providing, these AI powered experiences. And, and it's so interesting because, the AI, so much of the discussion is around the technology, what it is, how it works. Uh, People, and I asked you who it's for, and I asked so many companies this, like, who's going to implement AI? Like, who are the end users of AI going to be? And everyone's still figuring that out.
Yeah.
Whether companies will establish a chief AI officer, or if the CIO will establish, an AI practice under their work, or if data engineers will sort of, they're adjacent to AI because they have all the data. Maybe they'll just absorb AI too, or bring on some AI domain experts, or maybe it's fully its own engineering function. It seems like so many companies are working through this. So I want to get your take, what's your vision for the future of LLMs and AI?
My vision. So I would say there's a lot of information that is available around us. Some of it has been extracted, some of it not been extracted. I think my big vision is that we would be able to build models that are able to take advantage of all of that information that is available around us, implicit or explicit, to be able to make our lives better. And that could be different things for different people, which is one of the best things why LLMs took off, which is the ability to be able to personalize the user experience for every single model. Where we've gone towards, these boring models that work the same way for almost everybody, toward bringing on that perspective of HCI into our work.
Excellent, excellent. And, I think this is going to be, one of these topics that, people are, once you're past the foundations of knowing how enterprises can use this technology and how, all types of organizations can use this technology, the next is really operationalizing it. So if you want to operationalize LLMs and AI, I think the work that you're doing is really incredible, and because you have both the academic depth and the industry knowledge, and I think everyone appreciates your perspectives on this as well. So I'll definitely be following along with your work. Where
I
can
think the big question right
go ahead.
now for almost everybody in the industry is, do we build the things that we want to, or do we focus on monetization? Because if you're trying to build the things that you want to, the support isn't really there because models aren't reliable enough, or there are quite a few technical challenges in the way to getting there. So pretty much everybody is like, yeah, we want to build, but are we sure that these are the right models? Or are we sure we're ready for the regulatory and the compliance risk that comes with these models as well?
It's they're all very, interesting and new topics, and the people who already done it are going to have the most leverage to sort of scale it out and operationalize it. And that being said, I think to my listeners, people should follow along with your work. Where can people follow along with your work?
That's a question. I'm still trying to figure out which is which. There's stuff on my website I try to put up. But again, I'm so focused on the book deadlines right now. It's very much like sometimes you'll see me on Thread, sometimes you'll see me on Twitter, sometimes you'll see me on LinkedIn. But my website will have more of like serious work. So probably I think if you don't want to hear jokes, then maybe just go to my website and sign up for the newsletter. That's where I'll do the serious stuff or
Okay.
announce things.
Excellent, excellent. We'll have those links down in the pod description for the listeners who want to check it out. So you have your website, you're on Twitter,
I'm
X.
just at Go Abi Aryan everywhere on LinkedIn, on Threads, on Instagram, on Twitter, and I get bored with social media. I get annoyed with social media on a different one, then come back. But Twitter is certainly where I'm most active, but don't expect ML content from me on Twitter. It's a mixed bag. It's a very much a mixed bag.
Well, either way, I mean, if we are privileged enough to see one of your rare tweets, we know it'll be great.
The good thing, which will be coming out very quickly, is I finished like a 30-page report on LLM ops for O'Reilly, which will be published on their website. Right now, they're in the editing post-production phase. So most likely it should be published around January or December. I'm not entirely sure. It depends how much time they take. But that would be a fun introduction to my book, as well as give people the framework then start working.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Abi Aryan, thank you so much for joining today's episode of What's New in Data. Very excited about your work. It's very cutting edge, both from a technical depth and industry application perspective. So we'll definitely be following along with you. And to the listeners, thank you for tuning in today's episode. Abi, have a great rest of your day.